Okay, so I just wanted to double check before it's time. Can everyone access their cameras? Awesome.
Hey, Crystal, it's McCall. I probably won't use my camera just because I'm in a different area and I kind of have some sketchy cell service.
No
but
problem.
I'm happy to turn it on if you guys want me to at any point.
No worries. Thank you. And I can start. Tristan, I'm going to start sharing to make sure everything's going properly here.
Sounds good. Right at 1:30, I'll start the.
Yep. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Sure can.
Okay. Great. So far, so good. I shouldn't say that.
Yes, this morning's group was a bit more IT difficult.
Oh boy.
But I think I've learned my
Well,
lesson.
Having a task force at 8 a.m. is a tough one as it is.
For real.
So give yourself some grace.
Thanks.
Shut my door. Is Jacob here yet?
No, I don't see him yet.
Tristan, will you wait 1 second before you start? Jacob just sent me a message that he's in a link, but no one else is here. So something tells me he's in the wrong place. So just if everyone could wait just 1 more second, please.
Yeah, no worries. I can, do you want me to send him the?
I would love that. Thank you. Well, Eric's here, so okay.
All right, that's sent. So hopefully you'll get it soon.
Great.
It is Jacob Williams, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Cool.
Over the last year.
There he is. Hi, Jacob.
Hello, how many participants do we have? Because there was at least one other person in the other room I was in with me.
I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8,
Okay,
9. All right, Tristan, I think we can get started. Thank you.
All right, the webinar has started.
Thank you.
all right. Crystal, who is running these slides? Tristan, are you doing that?
Nope, I am. So,
You are.
yep.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today as we begin sort of officially after our kickoff last week, looking at our chapter 57, which is around teacher licensing. For those of you who haven't met me, I've met many people on the call. My name is Jacob Williams. I work for the Region 17 Comprehensive Center. So the Comprehensive Center is a network of technical assistance providers that's across the United States, divided up into different regions. The task of our centers is to provide support and capacity building to state departments of education. Region 17 is tasked with supporting Montana and Idaho specifically. So I am helping Crystal as we navigate through this work to develop and come up with review recommendations for Chapter 57, the effort being to improve the chapter to make sure that we can continue to have teachers of the highest quality in our classrooms across the state. So with that, Crystal, we can move on to our next slide. Today, in our time together, we have a couple things we want to accomplish. We have some sad news to begin with, which Crystal will discuss us about. I'm sure many people are aware of the passing of Dr Cahill, who was on our task force. We want to take a look and just quickly recap our discussion from last week, put together some processes to help us move through quickly as we work to develop these revisions, look at the timeline, where we need to be and when we need to be there. And then we're going to focus today on the language of counselor licensing and look also at the overlap between how counselor licensing and the path to being an administrator interact, and in hopes of coming up with some initial draft recommendations. And then we'll look at where we want to go next. Give an overview of how we envision the process looking as we move forward too. So any questions before we move forward at this point? All right, silence means everybody agrees with everything I said. So Crystal, we can move on.
Like Jacob said, I am Crystal Andrews. I am the Educator Licensure Director here at the OPI. And I do want to begin, Deputy Superintendent Allen and myself would like to acknowledge the passing of Dr. Cahill. His memorial is this afternoon, here in a few minutes, actually, I believe. And we all know that it is a great loss. He was part of this task force. And with that, I would like to do, if you're all right with, a moment of silence for Dr. Cahill. And then I'll say a few more words. Thank you. Thank you for that. Obviously, our thoughts and prayers are with his family, friends, colleagues, and so many that he has influenced and impacted in the state of Montana. Knowing Dr. Cahill, he would want us to continue with this great work and this important work. And that's why we are holding our meeting today, to keep that, keep it going in the right direction. And I just want to say how sorry we are for this loss. And I definitely wanted to make that, the beginning of our time together today, because it is a sad day. Hard to kind of follow up from that, but moving forward, I just wanted to remind you that we have the Google site, and Tristan has been working so hard to get everything there. Our agendas, meeting minutes, any homework, or anything that you need to view prior to our meetings will be on that site, along with the agendas, if I didn't say that. If you have trouble getting into it, please just let us know. It's a learning curve for us all in trying to get everything there. The slides will be there as well. Obviously, we have a small group today, most likely due to the memorial this afternoon. So we will be sure that all the information is there for everyone that is not in attendance, but also for us to look back on as well. So just a quick recap of last week. We talked about what makes a quality educator. I compiled I think I got everybody's ideas down, and that will be on the Google site as well, everyone's thoughts and ideas. But I was able to capture sort of the big themes, and these were what kept coming up within the work that we were talking about. Strong relationship and commitments to students was definitely highlighted the most. And then followed by master at their skill, ability to adapt to change and continuous improvement. And that is so important today. And obviously having a passion and that growth mindset. So with that, moving forward within the work of Chapter 57, Educator Licensure, I think it's important to keep those things in mind. All right, Jacob.
Thank you, Crystal. So some nuts and bolts to get out of the way as we jump off. to help us really kind of figure out how we work together and then how we want to make decisions. Part of this at this point is probably old hat, as we're going to look at some just functions of Zoom, and then also talk about how we can reach consensus. So as we've all become more familiar with the virtual interactions, everyone hopefully has had opportunity, more than you ever wanted, to engage via Zoom over the last year. But as we go through these meetings, feel free to use the chat. You can discuss among yourselves in the chat. We'll be trying to monitor it to the greatest extent possible, Tristan and Crystal and myself. If you have a question that you want to put before the group, at the bottom, you should see the raise the hand option. If you can put that up, then we get an alert. And then also I'll ask Tristan and Crystal, you guys help me monitor that as well. We do ask that if you're not speaking, keep your microphone on mute. If you don't do that, we will probably mute you. I just learned I have that power. I've already muted somebody during the call, but to the greatest extent that you can monitor yourself and just keep it on mute, because you never know what kind of background noise we're going to pick up, and it seems to be random what it is. And one thing to double check is make sure your name shows up correctly. So if you haven't ever changed your name, you can hover over your picture, your camera that's in the gallery, and you'll see there's a 3 little line that should be in the upper right-hand corner. If you click on those 3 little lines, you'll have the option at the very bottom of that menu that says rename. So we always just like to make sure that everybody has their name show up correctly so that we know who you are. So if everybody takes 2 seconds, double check that. I'm certain everybody's name is correct, as again, we've become old hat at this point in time. But, can you shift the gallery view at the top to the view option? I think upper right-hand corner of the screen, it says view, and maybe you can change to side-by-side gallery, even though we are in the webinar. I'm not 100% certain of that, but if you can't change, and I apologize. I do think we should have the option to still change our name, though. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Crystal. Go on.
This one?
No, next one. Let's just skip that one.
Okay.
So what we ask everybody as we move through is just let's be respectful of everybody, be supportive of ideas, be present, and let's be open. We hope to revise these and make adjustments to the chapter. That means we have to certainly put forth some new ideas, and we want to be open to those ideas. So while everybody, I'm sure, has ideas already formulated based upon experience, let's be open to hearing everyone else's ideas. Be present while you're here. Nothing is easier than while you're on a Zoom to be doing something else. I assure you, I am the worst offender of that, of doing other tasks while other people are talking on Zoom. But please try to be present to the greatest extent, as a lot of what we're doing will be oral. So we'll have to really pay attention and listen to what our colleagues are saying so that we can be engaged. Is there any other norm that a group member would like to discuss and add that you don't think these 4 would cover that would be essential? Right. I just also encourage you, as we be open, remember the mantra that productive conversations may not be comfortable. And by that, it means that if you're in a comfortable conversation, everybody is agreeing. And if everybody's agreeing, then we're not necessarily making improvements. So be open to a little bit of uncomfortableness that someone may disagree with what you're saying, but that'll help us get to the best place moving through that. So if we can move to the next slide, Crystal. So then how do we accomplish our purpose in terms of process? And this will be a relatively simple thing, but what we want to do is we're going to reach consensus oftentimes in terms of here's a proposed revision. How do we reach that consensus? So I think there's a click, Crystal. And so the one thing I'd like for the group to do, and I recognize that not everybody is here, but we have enough to reach consensus that hopefully we can move forward with the group. And that is, we agree to move forward with the changes once consensus is reached. All right. But to do that, we have to gain an understanding that consensus does not mean unanimous. Right? But having a consensus does mean that you can live with the decision. You will support your colleagues in implementing the decision, meaning whatever recommendation we have. And that once consensus is reached, you will do nothing to impede the implementation of the decision. Tristan, did you see there was something in the chat that asked you a question? Just want to point out. And we also want to put forth that we're going to reach all consensus in a public forum. So that's one reason why we're using the webinar format, so that it can be open to the public. So any recommendation / revision that we decide to put forward, we'll reach a consensus on that in this public forum. That does not mean that moving forward, if the group decides and we come to it, we may not do some homework, drafting revisions in some smaller groups that could be brought to the larger group to discuss and reach consensus on. But any sort of final decision to say, yep, this is what we want to put forward, this is what we believe is the best option at this point, we'll reach a consensus in this public forum so that everybody can know what happened and how it occurred. Anything on this slide that anybody'd like to comment on or does not think is appropriate to help guide the work of the group forward? Well, real quick, Tristan, maybe you can help me out, but Dean, the difference with the webinar is the idea of a panelist or a participant, and you have limited functionality in terms of what you can and cannot do. And the backside of Zoom is different in terms of how it's set up and how it works. The webinar format allows for people to just call in and listen, but not actively be seen or have any control over the chat, things like that. So you can sort of divvy up who can do what in terms of interacting with the Zoom. That's my understanding of how it's set up. Is there anything else, Tristan, that we could add?
Yeah, Jacob, I just think there's a few people in the gallery that are supposed to be panelists. So we're just behind the scenes trying to get that all figured out. So apologize for the, I'm multitasking, as you said.
There we go. Excellent. So yeah, Dean, I think I just promoted you to panelist. So let's see if it moved it over. It appears that I can do that.
Yep, I think we've got everyone promoted. Sorry about that. I think I got a list of our task force members a while ago and they may have been updated.
And I think since it's such a small group today, we can kind of deal with this. I'm pulling up the list now as well. So just, if you want to keep talking a minute, Jacob, I'll try to figure this out behind the scenes. I apologize.
Okay, there you go. So we could see that, Crystal. I just want to let you know we could see your files. So problem number one, there's attendees and panelists. So if someone is an attendee, we just need to make sure that if they're on the panel or not, and we may have to move you over based upon what it is. So that's Tristan's working on that behind the scenes. Sorry for the difficulty, Dean, anybody else that was stuck over in the attendee section. There's a real life problem-based project of what it looks like. So reaching consensus, we need a method to do that. And so on the next slide, I'm going to present 4 ways of which we can reach consensus, and then we're going to put up a poll so that we can vote and determine how we want to do it. So we can decide that consensus is just a simple majority. Okay, so simple majority is meaning, anything more than 50% of the people say yes, then we can consider that a consensus. We also could say that consensus requires a supermajority, meaning we need 60% of the available group members to vote yes on something, on moving it forward. So today we have 17 panelists. 60% would be like 17, 6, 8, 10. We need 10 people to vote, give or take, to get 60%, right? So that's option number 2. Option number 3 would be you could have only one dissenter, right? So that would mean that for a consensus, you have to have everybody on board but one person, right? Or we could say consensus is everybody's on board except for 2 people. I mean, you could have 2 dissenters. So I'm going to put the poll up in just a second and ask you to choose one of these options as to what you think is the best definition of consensus that we'll use moving forward. If we have a simple majority, we'll say there's a consensus. If we have a super majority, we'll make that our consensus. We can have everybody but just one dissenter, or we have everybody but 2 dissenters. So we'll let the group vote on what they think is the best method. I will say executive decision as facilitator for this decision moving forward. Here, we're going to just use a simple majority to make this decision, and then whatever wins this vote is what we'll move forward with from here on out. So Tristan, if you're in a position to launch that poll, there it is. If everybody could quickly vote on which of the methods. It's like maybe one more person eligible to vote. Just going to wait 5 more seconds to give that person a chance if they're working on it. If it's not working, let us know in the chat. Okay, looks like we have a pretty clear winner in supermajority. So that means anytime we have to make a decision, we will ask for a vote, and a supermajority is achieved, then we can move forward. As each of you know, in most cases, we'll reach a decision based on discussion. And everybody, it'll be clear through our discussion that there's agreement or not, and if we can move forward. This will really be in the case that we're having a good back and forth and we're not seeming to come to any clear decision and what we want to do. And so Crystal or myself will just be monitoring the situation, and we'll say, okay, this seems like a good time for us. We need to step in and take a vote on this and see if we want to move forward or not. And in that vote, if we reach a supermajority, then we'll move forward. So that's how that will work. Thank you, everybody, for that. And timeline, Crystal.
Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about the timeline for our task force, and thank you, Chris Stockton. I think you're in the gallery. She helped me even know what the MAPA timeline was. And so it is the Montana Administrative Procedures Act. And Cheryl asked, she was going to present this, but she was not available. So she asked me just to share that it's understood that if we present some recommendations to the board at the July meeting, that would be considered meeting 1. It would then take 2 more meetings, and then the final decision would be in January. So it is definitely a process, and it just gives us a really good snapshot of how long and the work that we're doing, what goes into it. I know McCall is here, and I didn't know maybe if you had anything else you wanted to share about that, since this is sort of a new process to me.
Yeah, thanks, Crystal. The only thing I would add to this is typically CISPAC, our Certification Standards and Practices Advisory Council, does have an opportunity to review any kinds of recommendations that come to the board prior to their presentation to the board. So you'll see the July 15th, 16th date here. CISPAC does actually meet July 14th. So there would be an opportunity for CISPAC to review it that day before, should you actually want to bring something to the board on the 15th or 16th.
Great. And Cheryl did say that, and I forgot to mention it, so I'm glad I asked. Thank you, McCall. Any questions or more information you would like that I can gather? Okay.
Real quick. So Crystal, if we had a deadline as to when we would like to make sure we have all of our recommendations finalized, what would that be on this timeline?
I believe, and don't quote me on this, even though I know we're recording, I believe Charles said that the goal is to have everything completed by July 1, 2020.
Not July, I can't, not July 1, 2020. That was a year ago.
2022.
Okay.
Sorry, I looked at my notes in
Yeah.
2022. Yeah, no, we're not going backwards, unfortunately.
Okay.
July 1, 2022. And again, don't quote me. I'm pretty sure that's what she said, that we want to have everything sort of wrapped up by then.
Okay, so we have quite a bit of a runway then.
Yep.
And Jacob, oh, go ahead,
Jacob, if I
Sharon.
may. Sorry, that's okay. If I may?
Please.
Go ahead, Sharon.
Okay. My name is Sharon Carroll, and I was chair of the Board of Public Ed for 5 years and was on there for 12. And so I watched this process go through quite a few times. And I thank Chris at the Board of Public Ed offices in McCall for letting us see this map, a timeline. I also did watch this process a few times. When it's presented to the Board of Public Ed, then once the public comment period is engaged, then sometimes the public comment does trigger some changes in what was presented to the Board of Public Ed. So I believe, and Chris and McCall, correct me here, but that would start that timeline over again, because once another change is made, if it after it's presented to the Board of Public Ed, then that timeline could look just a little bit longer than what you're seeing here, based on what the Board of Public Ed receives for public comment.
And Sharon, this is McCall. I actually don't know enough to know if that's the case. I know, Diane and Angela are on here as well, and they might remember how that works, but I'm not sure that that's the case, but I'll certainly look into that to make sure.
Thank you. It did happen in the past before, so, but that does not affect this group's work.
Thank you, Sharon, for that institutional knowledge.
Yes,
that is helpful. Any other questions about timeline before we move forward and dig into our sort of meat of our work today? Okay. So today, as mentioned, we're really going to look at the topic of counselor licensing, and then secondarily how it overlaps with school administrator licensing. What we see on the screen here is the specific language to the specialist license for school counselor, 10.57.435, as it currently stands. And so I just want to give everybody a second to look at this. We'll come back to it, but now I want to review this on your own, because the next slide will be a synthesis of the comments that you submitted related to this as we think about revisions. So Sharon, I think that's a question that we'll see on the next slide, but Crystal, can you address Sharon's question specifically as you interpret in your day-to-day work?
Sure. Again, remember, I am new to this role, but I am under the impression the answer is no. that they do not need a K-12 teaching license first. And I see some heads nodding, so I think I am right. So yay. Thanks, Angela and Nick. But no, and I think that's part of the conversation for sure. In terms of then talking about the admin piece, that they do not need to have the teaching license or teaching foundations.
So if, has everybody had a chance to read this so that we can move on and continue discussion about it? If you haven't used the link that's on our website to get to the chapter itself, it might be useful to pull that up and just have on the side of your screen too, so that, so you could have this as reference, or if you have the slides, so that you could look at this. But we will move away from this for a minute and then come back to it. But if you'd like to have it, then want to just give a second to pull forward. Note the reference to ARM 1057-102 is in the bottom. That's actually the language specific to counselors. That's in the small print at the bottom of this page too, if anybody was wondering about that. So I do want to, we're going to split this in two conversations. Our first conversation is really focused just on this and thinking about the counselor license, because we had comments that were specific to this in itself. So if we can go to the next slide to see what the input that we have been given, and I know there's probably people on the call with other input. The first piece of the comment was that related to counselor licensing was some degree of difficulty for certified teachers moving into the counselor license. There was a question of clarity about having the teaching experience under the current rule, and our understanding of the current rule is that teaching experience is not required to obtain the counselor license, so long as you can meet the requirements that were on the previous slide, which is a master's degree and the 600 hours and the other requirements. And the first question to really, I think, for discussion in the group is, the current language requires counselors to have a master's degree. Is that an area that we should consider? Is that a necessity as we think about that? And I have the floor open to thinking about discussion. What is anybody's thoughts on that?
I guess my initial thought or question is, what are their bachelor's degrees? What leads them to seeking the master's degree specific to counseling, which unfortunately pigeonholes them in public school employment?
For context, I think that and Nick, you're probably getting at it, there's probably multiple bachelor's degrees that someone that could lead them into getting the master's in school counseling. And so currently the ARM as written does not specify what that is. And so that potentially leads to some of our further difficulty. Does anybody have, is anybody on the call happen to be a school counselor or know specifically any additional context of that?
This is Sharon Carroll. Not a school counselor, but I guess I do have a question about why there isn't a school counselor or maybe a representative from the State Association of Counselors on the panel. This seems like we're in items that need clarification here.
I don't know that we talked about it on the kickoff call. Crystal, could you just quickly talk about how we put the panel together?
Tristan actually may know better. I was given the panel from Cheryl, so I didn't have anything to do with the selection. I know there was a process. It wasn't just, pick a name out of a hat kind of a thing, but I don't know what that was. But I acknowledge what Sharon's saying, that if we're speaking on counselors, we should have probably somebody with a little bit more expertise in that. I don't know though, I'm sorry.
I do know the process of selecting the task force members. There were surveys sent out, which I'm sure all of you participated in, and then the deputy superintendent went through and I assume contacted you and made those selections within the people that had responded through the surveys, and possibly other modes as well. I'm not fully aware.
And do you see Dean's comment that last week there were more people, I think, interested in this, and maybe even more counselors or working with counselors on the call last week? So we may have somebody, Sharon, but they may just not be here today, unfortunately. Thank you, Dean.
I might address, just if you wouldn't mind, a little bit of a lot of the counselors' undergrad degrees were in a related teaching field, and then were perhaps talked into becoming counselors by their districts. So it's not uncommon to have your counselors in your district that were teachers in that district or a nearby district prior to that time, which I think led a lot of the field to believe that it was a process that was required, that they be a teacher with a standard class 2 teaching license first, which led counselors then to have teaching experience, which really did build a lot of trust in our system with our counselors on board. But it certainly looks like that wasn't a requirement. So I'm not sure what a bachelor's degree in a related field would look like, perhaps psychology, but at any rate, I think most of the counselors that we have were teachers in systems prior.
Yeah, John, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Jacob. John Mielek, I work in the teacher prep program at MSU in Bozeman. And while I'm not part of the school counseling program, I do assist with their internships. And I think the master's degree has more to do with the CACREP accreditation. This is, I think, a pretty standard requirement across the country that it's a master's level program. So I think it might fall under a different set of rules that we don't have, that is setting the expectation of the master's degree.
Thank you, John. And Erica, you have your hand up?
I was going to say, I agree that many of the counselors I have worked with in the past have been prior teachers, but I did have a counselor, my previous job, who was a nurse prior to getting her master's degree. She was an excellent counselor, but she didn't come with an education background. So just to add that information into the pot.
And I'd like to say Jewel Walker, one of our task force members, put in the chat, many serve dual roles, teachers and counselors in Class C schools. And I know I came from a district with that a teacher and was the teacher was also the counselor.
And if everyone did not get a chance to look at it as we continue this conversation, on the agenda, there was a link to a website that listed counseling requirements across the United States.
And Jacob, I just looking through what we tell potential applicants is that we would be looking for things like psychology, family science, and teacher ed preparation. They say those are more natural feeders, but they do look and accept other students from other academic backgrounds, but those are on more individual reviews.
Dean?
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I know in Great Falls, the last 3 elementary counselors we've hired have all come from the mental health side of counseling and have been behavioral specialists, and that have gone on then to get their counseling masters.
Erica, did you have your hand up again, or is it just still up? Okay.
And to John's point about what they encourage folks to come in with there at Montana State University, in the Montana University system, we don't have any undergrad studies in counseling per se. We have MEDs in school counseling, Masters of Arts in school counseling, Masters of Education in counseling, and Masters of Science in it in Montana.
And I am doing a very unscientific scan of that website, and it seems to be that the master's degree is certainly across the majority of states explicitly stated. It is difficult to know in some cases, speaking to Angela's point, some states say an approved program in school counseling. It could be that some state universities offer undergraduate degrees in school counseling, so it may require some more investigation to figure that out. But.
This is Diane Fladmo. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm not in a very good spot and I'm on my phone, so it's not the best connection. But I know one of the concerns I've heard, and I'm not speaking one way or another on this issue, is the evaluation of staff. And what I am not sure of is what kind of training those non-teaching background staff members would have if they're going into administration, in terms of staff evaluation and how that might be handled. Am I getting way ahead of myself?
Just a skosh, Diane. That'll be the next set of questions, but hold that thought. We'll definitely get to that.
Thank you.
So the master's degree, any other comments on that?
This is Dean.
Yes, Dean, go ahead.
So kind of a question with the master's degree. So I guess more of a scenario here. What a lot of our some of our staff members, like maybe a librarian, a lot of those programs are master's level degrees. But if you have a master's in another program, then it becomes, you could get a certification from the university system. Is there a reason why that couldn't be an opportunity at the university system, where if our teachers had a master's degree, they wouldn't have to go back and get a whole counselor's master, but they could just get add-on to their master's specific to counseling? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Anybody at the university level have a comment on that?
I don't know if they would get a second master's. They do give them credit for things that they have done in other programs. But I think that would go towards that. It's a 60 credit master's. So I think they would waive some of the courses that had overlap, or they could see that they had the content covered in a different area, that they wouldn't have to retake the content that they've already taken.
Thanks for that clarification.
Another piece of important context, I think, goes back to what John said, and that's the accreditation of, can we call it CACREP, the counseling accreditation program that is mentioned in the HARM itself. When we get back to it, the accreditation accredits master's and doctoral level programs. So there's a ripple effect there if they make a change. The accreditation does not accredit undergraduate programs in school counseling. And I am not 100% certain about this. I'm hoping someone else can add to this, but I also believe that the accreditation program probably generates the 600 hours as well. And that's where that number comes from, that it is associated with their accreditation requirements. Does anybody have any context on the fourth bullet, which is the word regionally that's in the ARM? And I think it says a regionally accredited program. There was the comment as to, is that limiting if with the word regionally as to what programs can be accepted? Does anybody have any context of that or know why it might be there?
All of our programs are regionally accredited by regional accreditors. And so that is something that is a higher ed term. It means we've gone through a separate rigor of accreditation. It's more about our program than it is about, Montana, Idaho. It's not that type of regional accreditation.
John, what is the regional accreditor for Montana specifically, or who is?
You would ask me that question. Angela might know off the top of her head. I could look it up. Our programs are accredited by CAPE. Our counseling programs are accredited by KCREP.
Yeah.
And then we have regional accreditation at the university level that I can look it up if it's something that people have an interest in. But it's just these different tiers of people that are looking to make sure we're providing strong, relevant programming.
So to clarify, it's not like just limiting it to just Montana. It's region means something other than state to state. So the question is it limiting? It's not limiting because it doesn't have anything to do with different states, correct?
Correct. So if you went to the University of Mississippi, they would be accredited by the Southern Region Education Board, for instance, right? So that's their regional accreditor.
Right. So what actually limits people from out of state coming into Montana are the licensure rules, not the rules at the higher institution. We work with people from other institutions all the time. We have transfer students. We have people that graduate to come back to school. But the licensure rules are the ones that actually limit people coming in and out of the state on licenses.
So in these comments, I also want to point out, someone did put in an additional comment at the bottom that was the amount of FTE needed for each student. And we wanted to highlight that we think that's associated with Chapter 55 within the administrative rules and not Chapter 57 that makes that determination. So we see and hear your comment and know that Chapter 55 revision process will begin more in earnest this fall. So keep your eye out for that and opportunities to make adjustments there. So any questions about the comments that were submitted before we kind of go back and take a look at the language in the rule itself to see if we have any recommendations? John, go ahead.
Yeah, our school counseling program is accredited by the Western Regional Graduate Program. And so all master's graduate, doctoral students who are residents of member states, they are under this WRGP approval.
And I was doing some quick Googling to try and confirm the 600 hours associated with the KCREP accreditation, and it seems to be, again, one of the accreditation requirements for field practice, field placement. To achieve accreditation, you have to have at least 600 hours. That's how that number came to be. So Chris, if we can move to the next slide and take go back to look at the language of the rule again. With this group, acknowledging the absence of a school counselor representative at this point, is there any language revisions, adjustments we would like to put in that we can maybe bring back to the larger group to discuss at this point of this rule itself, knowing we haven't gotten into the administrator piece of it yet? We're just looking at what it takes to be a counselor.
If I may, this is Sharon Carroll.
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
It looks to me, and I remember as we changed this rule that on 1C, we had an out for folks who did not earn the degree from the CREP program, and that was that recommendation from an accredited specialist program. So that's where that 600 hours then ended up being looped in again. And those recommendations came through us, to us, really through that teacher preparation program component as well. So our university systems helped develop those guidelines.
And Sharon, I read sort of that C2 out as being in unique cases, the state board will review and determine if it works or not.
Right.
Kind of how it is.
And here we are.
Yeah. So it's like, meet this. If none of that works, we'll send your case to the state board and they'll make a decision. Kind of.
Right. But the fewer of those that the Board of Public Ed has to deal with, I think that's why we're meeting. So the fewer of those the board has to deal with, the better off we are. And truthfully, people can appeal to the Board of Public Ed. It's a long process though. And really for every one that appeals to the Board of Public Ed about that, there's 10 in the background who either didn't know or decided not to take a job with that district because of that. So, and we did at one point include language to ask the Office of Public Instruction to give the Board of Public Ed guidance in how many of these situations we end up having, which I think is why we're at the table here, which I greatly appreciate. But again, folks don't always choose sometimes to not appeal that to the Board of Public Ed, but there certainly are options for people to get there.
Is that something that could be put in the licensure listing right there? Something about different things there, like you said, this exceptions?
And Sharon, this is McCall. Are you talking specifically about the unusual case rule that they often come to the board through?
Yes, I am. And it ceases to become unusual when so many people do that. And it really does burden the Board of Public Ed because at that point, then attorneys from both sides end up getting involved and it's a very expensive process. So if this rule could reflect a little bit better what might be becoming better language, then that's probably that. Again, that's why we're sitting here. But you're right, quite right, McCall, that unusual cases cease to become unusual.
Yeah, and Sharon, I think you're totally right. I will say that we do have a new agency legal services representative. And through that process, we have actually determined that the Office of Public Instruction no longer has to originally deny the license, and rather they can bring it to the board right off the bat as an unusual case. So the educator no longer has to appeal to that denial. I mean, it still has to come to the board, right? So the board is still seeing it, but it does remove a little bit of that red tape around OPI denying it, and then the board, and then the educator having to appeal it, and then, you know, down the road it comes to the board. Now what OPI is doing, and this has been agreed upon both by Board of Public Ed Legal and OPI Legal, is that the board now, or OPI now, will just receive this, determine that it is in fact part of the unusual case administrative rule, and then bring it right to the board. So we are trying to streamline that process a little bit. I think to your point though, it is still unusual, and it still is part of the unusual cases. So if there's anything that we can do here through this rule revision to kind of remove some of those, would definitely streamline that process even more.
I guess a question that I have as I continue to just look at this is, do we have on the ready a number of schools who in the last couple of years who have been in advice or deficiency status as a result of not having a counselor? Excuse me. Because I guess I'm just wondering if we're getting to the crux of an issue with anything with this conversation if we don't take a look at that and we leave things as is.
I think I can find an answer to that question, Angela, relatively quickly. My question for discussion, while I might look for that, would be, are we aware of any other accreditation entities in the United States besides CUCREP for school counseling programs?
And I guess my question was more specific to the number of Montana K-12 schools who are in advice and deficiency status.
Yes, certainly. And that's, I'm efforting to find that for you. I think I have a report at my ready that I can find out. But if, I guess my question then was, is the rule limiting by limiting of this specific accreditation program? If we're looking at like C, you know, are there other, I mean, it does say regionally accredited college or university program. So I guess that covers it, doesn't it? It's C1.
And I think to John's point earlier, I think that we're talking, this is the accreditation standards as per CA CREP. What we can do with licensure in consideration of flexibilities might be in addition to that. I mean, they can still have an accredited program. They can graduate from an accredited program or be on track to graduate from an accredited program, depending on what we do here.
And I think that's what the licensing office looks at, is how, if someone comes from a non-K-CREP program, how does the program that they took line up to the K-CREP standards? And that's what they base their approval or denial of licensure on, is how it compares to the national accrediting standards. And so there probably are some non-K-CREP programs that are approved and running and operating in total transparency. And then what we do is we look at the back end of when they're doing that licensure review, and they're looking to see how does this line up. And I think that second part of that is when if they do get denied, they have that opportunity to put together how their program does fit, and maybe they can show different artifacts and things, syllabi and things that might go more in depth than what the board or what OPI would review in a licensure review. So there, you know, I think that having the K-CREP be the national standards that we all follow, I know for our program that would be a pretty tough one to say, well, we don't need to follow K-CREP because that's their national standards. But then how do we recognize, I think the question is, how do we recognize people who come through these non-K-CREP programs?
this doesn't have particularly to do with the program, but for C schools, there is an option for them, and it's been about a year since I've looked into this, but that teachers can work as a school counselor under the auspice of, there is a group that would act as a mentor. And I don't remember all the specifics, but I don't know if that enters into this discussion, but there is that option also.
Right.
And I can actually speak a little bit more to that for the even smaller schools, rural schools, like where I taught in Wolf Creek. If we did not have a licensed counselor, as when I was a supervising teacher, you could take a course, on, do something to get, and I think it goes with that, Erica. But so there are some, there are other loopholes. Now, that doesn't mean I was endorsed in it, but I was able to provide that service. And so that, it met the accreditation.
Well, and in addition, if your K-12 size is under, I believe, 125, then you fall under the Montana Small Schools Alliance, and then you can, in fact, then use a regional. Thank you, Jewel, for that. You can use a regional plan through MSSA in order to meet those requirements. Thank you, Jacob, for putting up that link to the deviations. And I think what has spoken to a lot of us before about deviations is that we don't always know why. We know that they perhaps didn't have the number of FTEs of counselors per students that they needed, but we don't always know why that happened. Did the district advertise thoroughly? Did they interview a lot of folks and they just didn't want to come? I mean, what caused your school district to not have a school counselor and thus receive a deviation? I don't think is an item that's actually collected by OPI in the fall report. And that probably would be interesting information to know, because that would help us craft a part D for this rule if that's necessary. And I actually don't hear anybody on this panel objecting to some sort of an accreditation of an graduating from some sort of accredited program for counselors. So I'm not sure how we could add a D that would help us out, but thank you.
And I guess just in, the position that I'm in, yes, I'm co-facilitating, but also coming from the education licensure role here at OPI and thinking about all the time it takes our specialists to review evaluations if it isn't from, and then that takes the process even longer if they're having to research and see, does this meet the requirement? If there was a way for us to try to word this to take that time, time is money. And if we could get it to be something a little bit more efficient, then we could get our, evaluations done faster, et cetera, et cetera. So I have to throw that little plug in there. And, of course, if this is how we want it to stand, that's great. But it is time consuming. I watch them on a daily basis, having to, navigate through different channels like that.
Well, and this conversation has really been enlightening for me. And so maybe the conversation is less about the license for the school counselor and more about Chapter 55 and the flexibility therein for who would counsel students in a K-12 setting. And I think that all of what I've heard is lending me towards that. At the same time, as I'm just looking through each of the other licenses, I'm looking at an avenue through something like a Class 5 for a 1 and a 2, and there's something provisional that we do there as a state when it comes to licensure. And I'm not seeing anything like that here unless I'm completely missing something. So that's kind of a path that I thought that perhaps we could explore a little bit more, maybe in another meeting or something, because we don't have that provisional short-term path. And I don't know if that's something that we would want to consider. But if our work is to get to a place of more flexibility that will support our schools in meeting all of the standards, I think a conversation around something like that might behoove us.
I thought there was a pathway about that. I might be wrong about that, but I thought that you could get a provisional. for a counselors.
Well, it would make
Maybe not.
sense. They have the bachelor's, right?
Right. And you know, one thing that happened to us as a school district, and I know that this fell within the Office of Public Instruction's purview, but we had a school counselor here have an emergency authorization, a 4-year degree in psychology, no teaching experience. And yes, emergency authorizations are only for 1 year. We know it's for 1 year at a time. And that to me, because counselors actually serve as quasi-administrators anyway in Class C schools, that was an absolute disaster. I don't think that we should ever look for that to happen again. We discovered ourselves in a lawsuit pretty quickly, just not enough pedagogy, not enough of education really in it to assume that role. So what we can do here to help school counselors be fully licensed would help us a great deal. And it seems to me like that 3-year provisional is an option, maybe not.
Well, I just pulled it up.
There
and
it is.
Under the OPI, and I see with early childhood, elementary, middle, secondary, K-12 or P-12 special ed endorsement.
It's our webpage needs so much updating, and I apologize for that. And that is on our front of what we've been working on recently. But I pulled it up. There is a Class 5 provisional for school counselors.
Excellent. Then maybe we already have the flexibility. Good.
Yeah.
Right.
So basically, we need to publicize that a little better on the webpage. So I'm taking that note now. But there is an application. If you go under Angela, the counselor tab, Class 6 specialist counselor tab, it's hidden down at the bottom of that is where you can find it, but it's there. And I will make sure, taking this back, that we can make it more public, because it should be with the Class 5s as well. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
Do I read it correctly, the provision that you have to be within 4 courses of completing the certificate in order to qualify for it?
Yeah, that turns out to be pretty limiting. That's what causes our school counselors to say, whoop, can't get that one done. So maybe that's something to look at.
That's yeah. It is what it's saying. So yes, Jacob, you're correct, but maybe that is something that needs to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
So group, I'm going to ask, is there anything here we think we need to change, knowing that we're going to come back and look at the provisional piece most likely in our next meeting? Just thinking about counselors, because I do want to at least look at the admin piece before we wrap up today. We've got about 20 minutes left. Okay, so we're going to move on. Doesn't mean we can't ever come back to this, but at this point, we're going to move on. And if ideas come up, you'll have plenty of time to let us know what we might need to adjust. But if we could move on to the next slide, Crystal. And we're not going to have a ton of time today to really dig into this. So we'll probably push this off to our next meeting. But the issue that has been brought to our attention is there's no clear path for someone who may be licensed as a counselor, but achieve that license without having a experience teaching or with a bachelor's degree in education to become a licensed administrator, most likely due to the lack of the 3 years of teaching experience with a standard unrestricted license at the secondary level. So that this is the language of our 1057-435 that we looked at, and then the Class 3 administrative license, which is 57-416, kind of side by side. And then the next slide, we have the comments that were submitted from the group specific to this.
Ready for that?
Just a second, Crystal. Let's let everybody have a chance to read these side by side and see what we're talking about. Okay, so we do have these. We'll of course come back to these. I think if we could just move on to the comments now, Crystal, to generate our thinking, and it does sort of speak to is 3 years of teaching experience necessary and or sufficient for an administrative license? So we're kind of digging into both this counselor issue and the administrative licensing as well. The second comment really pushes the task force to think about meaningful teaching experiences needed prior to receiving the counselor license. This goes back to our previous arm in that there's no teaching experience required to be a counselor, which we clarified. It seems there's historical knowledge that maybe that used to be there, but isn't anymore. And by not having that as a requirement for a counselor, is that the limiting factor to moving into administration? If the teaching experience is not required, are there other adjustments we could make to help clear a pathway for counselors to move into school administration licensing? So thoughts about this in general, anybody who has dealt with this in your district, the frequency of it, ideas for adjustment? Sharon, you have your mute off. Do you have a comment?
Well, in my experience, I know that in a small school, what will quickly happen is your school counselor could in fact move fairly quickly if we change the rule here to becoming a principal. And then we know that schools of a certain size only have to have one administrator. So when that superintendent leaves, then your counselor sitting at your school with an administrative license will then become your sole administrator, perhaps. And they will be responsible then for all of the teacher evaluations in that small district. I mean, it could happen in any larger district. If they're in a larger district, but in a school, they have a principal, the principal leaves, then your school counselor is your principal responsible for teacher evaluation. And I guess one of my questions that I have, and I remember this coming before the Board of Public Ed last fall, but can somebody explain like the impetus behind this change being necessary?
So Erica, you have your hand up if you want to go ahead, and if anybody has a thought to share, and feel free to put your hand up too.
Well, I guess this doesn't address Sharon's last comment, but counselors do teach, at least in most schools, they do teach counseling classes, so that gives them some teaching experience. I agree with Sharon that when you are evaluating teachers, that's a problem. I do think that our counselors, in my experience, work very, very closely with administration. And so they understand a lot of the things that administrators do on a daily basis, probably more than a teacher. So I don't know if there's any verbiage that we could put in there that they've worked in professional, I don't know, credited for 3 years. I guess the other thing is, in hindsight, 3 years seems like a pretty short amount of time. I'm glad I had much more time than that before I became an administrator. I think the experience, 3 years is not very much experience to go into that level of responsibility. So just some thoughts there.
John?
Yeah. It used to be 6.
Yeah, we so in our administrative program here at MSU and at other campuses as well, this is not a MSU issue by any stretch of the imagination. We have school counselors that come in, and we have to advise them that if they enter our program, complete our program, they will go to the board of, or they'll go to OPI for their licensure, and they will be denied because they don't have 3 years teaching experience. Then they have to go to the Board of Public Ed, file an appeal, which may or may not result in them being approved for administrative licensure. And so we spoke with a bunch of school counselors, administrative program people, talking about this quite a bit. And the pathway right now from school counselor to school administrator, having someone complete a program, invest all the time, all the money, to be told you have to appeal this, opposed to, either no, you can't do it, or yes, you can, is not a very fair business practice. It's not particularly ethical to let people finish a program that may or may not lead to licensure. And so our administrative program folks would prefer to have more clear, consistent language that we can follow, that we know how to advise people. A lot of the things that we heard from school counselors and administrators as well was that the school counselors have a skill set that definitely fits with the duties of an administrator. They did talk about the K-CREP standards now have some teaching built into them, but we know it doesn't replace what you get as a classroom teacher. So I think there's definitely a lot of strong feelings on both sides of this particular issue. From the flexibility standpoint of trying to move someone, I think sometimes these issues come down to individual people we know, and we know that there are people that would be better well suited to move into administration than other people, and we want to fight hard for those folks, and we want to fight hard to keep the people out that shouldn't be in. And administrative rules don't care if you're a strong candidate or a weak candidate. They treat everybody the same, and so it's kind of a sticky wicket. And I don't know if Angela wants to add anything from our work group that she convened. She can definitely add a lot more if she chooses to.
John, you did a great job. I only have a few things to add. One of the things that we've worked on pretty solidly here at our office is educator recruitment and retention across the state, and specifically what the Montana University system can do to help schools address those efforts. And we have a group right now that is working specifically on Grow Your Own initiatives. But out ahead of this, we had a licensure subgroup of our efforts, and they met for about 6 months of last year to talk about what we could do to address any obstacles to licensure and address any of the limitations to recruitment and retention for school leaders across the state. And one of our recommendations as a result of that work to the superintendent's office was exactly this. And I'll just let folks know, in the interest of full disclosure, John was a part of that work. Marco Farrow, who was at the time part of MFPE, in fact, he held the position that Diane Fladmo holds now. Kirk Miller from School Administrators of Montana, he was a part of the conversation. Christy Steinberg of the University of Montana Licensure and Assessment Office. Linda Peterson from the Accreditation Division there at OPI. Christine Thatcher, who was at Licensure from OPI, and Julie Mergel. They were all a part of this conversation. And as John indicated, we did bring folks from our counseling prep programs to the table from across the state of Montana. Then we brought school administrators and school counselors, and this was what we heard. This was what we heard as far as flexibilities that made sense to folks. I think it was the November or maybe the September Board of Public Education meeting where a gal had gotten on from Whitehall, I believe, to advocate for exactly this. And so some of the themes that emerged from our conversations over a couple of months in this regard were as follows. As required by current ASCA standards, school counselor education includes substantial time teaching in classrooms, as you already heard. That's a part of the K-CREP. Practicing school counselors also spend substantial time teaching in the classrooms. School counselors possess holistic systems views of the school that is useful in school admin. School administrators use skills and knowledge learned and practiced in school counseling programs and in the school counseling profession, listening, advising, relationship building, social emotional learning and assessment, and they do so routinely. This next one is school administrators must assess the performance of classroom teachers and experience with classroom teaching as an important aspect of this. The same Danielson evaluation framework is used to evaluate school counselors, though not all school administrators have experience in school counseling. And then the ability to advance in one's career is important for educator and school leader retention. So I think you have a couple of real thoughtfully developed, compelling points made as a result of several months of bringing stakeholders from K-12 to the post-secondary arena together to say, how can we better in Montana meet the needs of our schools when it comes to school leadership? And we thought that this was a lift that made sense.
McCall?
Yeah, thanks. I actually just have a question for Angela. So did you guys look at any of the information that basically said, like, should your counselors who are likely eligible regardless of the 3-year teaching experience move into an administrative role? Do you have any data that would show like what would happen at those school districts? Are there some that would continue being in the accreditation deviation status, or would they move out of that? I'm just actually curious. I don't know. I apologize if this maybe isn't part of the conversation, but I'm just curious to know what would happen, because I do know there's that recruitment and retention issue of school counselors as well.
Well, I mean, I think it goes back to the question that Sharon Carroll asked earlier. I mean, do we know the reason why our schools are in their counseling accreditation deficiencies? I guess that's what I would answer there.
And that's totally fair. I was just curious if you guys had any data on that.
I think that's another interesting issue too, though, that by moving a counselor, which is certainly in a high need area, from the counseling position into an administrative position doesn't solve our recruitment and retention of counselors either. But at any rate, it seems to me like I guess I have this question to ask about school counseling is how much time in the classroom then do school counselors spend? And if you're a guidance counselor, just help me out with what the language would look like in order to be able to talk about teaching experience in that framework. Or classroom teaching experience there, if that's kind of what we're hung up on. I mean, is there language that could help us with that? Do all guidance counselors spend time in the classroom? I know by rule they need to teach courses, but in every system, do they all?
Diane, did you have a comment? No.
One of the comments I'd like to make is I guess I don't want us through licensure. I think counselors who choose to become a counselor, who choose to move from counseling to administration, they're going to find that path. What you just heard John Mielek say is that we need to be able to point to clear language in guiding our pre-service counselors, maybe at some time administrators on a path. And so I guess I don't want us to get caught up on the fact that, yeah, we're going to be moving one here and addressing this recruitment issue and leaving a vacancy here, because I think the counselors are going to make that move irrespective. But what we are talking about here is how can we better support counselors who from the field came to the table and said, we have this experience. We are working. And Sharon, I mean, I can't say that it happens in a strategic by design way. I can tell you that we had counselors come to the table. We were very thoughtful and deliberate in this conversation. And they all said that we are doing this work. We work with our classroom teachers. We're working with administrators. They are working with us. And I spent 20 years in the classroom. I mean, those folks are there, and maybe now more than ever, especially as we talk about college access and post-secondary planning. They're working with students, they're working with teachers on a daily basis. So I guess I don't want us to get hung up on the one end, we're going to lose the counselor to gain an administrator, because they're going to go that path. And if that's an advancement, we want to make it an advancement that can happen for them in the most seamless way and still serve students.
So thank you, Angela. I think we are going to need to wrap up and just quickly talk about next steps. I will leave as consideration to where we will start, and Tristan, if you'll make notes so we don't forget. Is the discussion not so much that the language around 3 years teaching experience is sufficient? Is there a need to add language that a certain amount of time in a specialist position is also sufficient to that, to alleviate the situations?
And I think
So-
in the future, we could address the 3 years. Is that sufficient for an admin? I mean, you know, that's not really what we were trying to address here, but I think that could be a future conversation if needed, especially knowing that it was 6 years before. Is it something that this, you know, this task force wants to look at as a different, you know, different section?
All right, so we just have about 3 minutes to wrap up. You know, our hub will be the Google site. Look there for resources, just where you'll find the links for the meetings. Our next meeting will be session 3. So if you were confused today and found the wrong link because you were looking at session 1, our next meeting is session 3. You can always send questions or suggestions as to how we move things along. We certainly will move, hopefully, to have more concrete suggestions as we move forward as to changes. For our next meeting, initial homework that we can leave you with today on the Google site, there is a report that was conducted by Region 17 Comprehensive Center. We conducted a series of focus groups with stakeholders across the state, asking specifically about items within 57 and 58 as to what was essential. We have compiled that input into this report. You can read that. And then also look for another Google form seeking input to come to you Monday afternoon or Tuesday morning to help guide our next question. Next section, of course, we'll begin, I think, right back where we just left off here with that admin/counselor discussion. And then also add in potentially the provisional licensing for counseling too, to come back and readdress that. I do hope moving forward, we can submit or solicit information from you that will help us identify some broad topics and ways we can break up the chapters. And the homework can be around having some small groups who can get together virtually and come up with suggestions of how or what revisions might be needed to bring back to the larger group, so we can look at those concrete things and then have discussions around that to help us move forward. We're still in the rush of that is daily life, putting together that structure to help move us forward. But that's where we hope to move to. Any other suggestions, please let us know. Next slide in terms of schedule. Here's our layout. We're weekly. We do know next week there could be a conflict with the Montana Education Virtual Summit and Job Fair that is occurring. We do anticipate going ahead with this meeting. But we know that some of you may not be able to attend. July 1st is the holiday weekend. We also do intend to go ahead and have that meeting. We know Chapter 58 is working alongside us, and they're going to meet that day as well. We also know that, that a few of you may have plans already, so we recognize that. And then the 8th, we don't see any potential conflicts at this point, but we do want to point out the 15th coincides with the Board of Public Ed meeting, and we know that many people will be attending that. Many of the OPI staff will be attending. So unless we hear any objections, we intend to not meet on the 15th.
And Angela, I did see in the chat way back, you said something about the calendar. Could you ask that question again, please? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Crystal, but I think it's been answered. It looks like we have the holiday weekend on July 1st, just because I was talking to some folks who were on the call today, and they would be out on that day as will I, so.
Okay.
I'm glad that it's the holiday weekend.
Yeah. If you do not intend to attend on the first, if you could shoot Crystal an email and we could get a count of that. And if we see that it's going to be a majority, then we can address that again next week. But at this point, our intention is to move forward. But again, if you intend not to be here, if you let Crystal know, we'll take a count and get a better sense of what the actual situation is.
Great.
So no meeting on the 15th, though.
Yes.
I didn't hear anybody complain about that. Okay, 2:01, we're 1 minute late. Thank you, everybody. Again, look for emails from us, read that report that's on the website, and we look forward to seeing you next week. I greatly appreciate today's conversation.
Yes. Thank you so much. Have a good day.